thank you. I'm super excited to be closing today's session. That's been amazing. And yeah, answer this very important but very difficult question, which is how do we scale something that works and not descend into chaos without burning yourself out or your team, hopefully. Yeah, and this has been, so I'm Morgane Peng, and this has been my challenge for the past 10 years. When I started, yes, in 2012, I was designing a trading platform, so for foreign exchange at Société Générale, the French financial group. It was mainly for institutional clients. And a few years later, we had more products. So it was mostly a mix of other trading applications like structural products, research, post-trade applications. And fast forward to today, we have more than 130 services on our platform. And it really ranges from anything that, for example, people will use to finance bridges, wind farms, video game studios, anyone? Or transaction banking for enterprises. You may have heard about the SWIFT network. Or even like tools for employees, such as managing risk, and we do have a lot of risk to manage in a bank. And a little bit like the Marvel extended universe, what we built for the platform, what we designed for the platform, is also used elsewhere in the organization, so they kind of leverage on what we built. So the question is, how do we make design work at scale for complex topics and organizations? Complex topics because, financial acronyms, right? So even before you can start doing your job, you have to get to understand what the hell people are talking about. And complex organizations because, well, silos. And it's hard sometimes when people don't talk to each other. I have to say, as a designer, this is even more disheartening, because how do you want to design something that is supposedly seamless when people don't talk to each other in the organization? I see some people nodding. I'm not alone. And you know, like those nice little organized circles? Well, I designed them this way because I wanted to introduce you in an organized way what I do, but the reality is more like something like this, with people who say this. So I just realized that these slides could be also used in architecture, because I know there's a lot of enterprise architects. But yeah, I realized I have to design something seamless for the users, and people don't talk to each other. So how do I do that? And keep my sanity. And it's funny because I realized there's been a shift in my industry, because a few years ago, most of the design leaders and recruiters were like, all right, we need to set up design. We need to start it, we need to implement it, we don't know how it's going to work out. And today, the conversation has much shifted towards, okay, we have design, it somehow works, but how do we scale it? And how do we keep our designers? Because, you know, if they're frustrated, they leave. So this is going to be my talk today. So all about the messy part of scaling, and I have to say before even scaling, is your approach right? And this is why for me it's going to be, how do we design things right? And we had learned a few things about that during our journey. Then how do you reuse a scale and learn to work with systems? And how do you adapt the org to be able to do all this? I'll walk you through some of the crises and dilemmas and identity crises that I've faced, and hopefully you can learn from it too. All right, design the right thing. Have you seen this meme before? Yeah, I feel it's time for me to wear this. Hold on. Okay, okay, yeah. When I saw it, I was amazed. I was like, oh, let me use that in all my serious presentation to get people to buy into design. And it worked to the point that one day we actually had to redesign something like the third thing. So that was a trading application. And I was like, yes, let me help. So for people who haven't seen, this is kind of me. Yeah, so many buttons, so many figures. Designers at school, we are taught about progressive disclosure. So, you know, simplifying everything, putting things into small pieces of UI, you know, step by step, basically what you will see when you use as a consumer, for example, a food delivery app. So we did it. We made it so simple that it was too simple. Ooh, and I'm losing my... Okay, it's not gonna stay on my head. Yeah, and people hated it. And yeah, that's bad. Like, wait, that's my studies. Don't you know what's good for you? I mean, that's what I studied at school, you know, like, you should be happy using that. Or were we wrong? And I realized later on that as designers, we often apply our own mental models to justify or think what's best for the users. And what we did at the end of the day is actually creating a black box, removing all the complexity so that people didn't know what they were doing. And that's why they hated it, not because, you know, we put some gradients on a screen. And when you think about it, what does do like Google even mean, or do like Apple? Because yes, Google for sure, when I say Google, you may be thinking about this, but it's also this. Ooh, great tables, lots of stuff in there. And this is Google Ad, and I think that represents more than 80% of Google's revenue. I think it's even the Alphabet revenue at this stage. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. And I'm sure at Apple, they also have like the consumer-facing Apple, and they also have like internal tools that may be more complex. So next up, I'm gonna show you two services that we design that is basically giving the same, answering the same use case for two different target populations. The first one is kind of a simplified FX tool, so foreign exchange tool that we give to French medium and small and medium enterprises so they can manage their foreign exchange exposure. So what do you think all traders use? Not this. They use something more like this. So this is mostly used by our internal sales traders, but obviously also people in large corporates, treasurers, financial institutions, local central banks. And both of them have a reason to exist, because the first one, obviously, we are giving much more like simpler products to them. And this one is for people who really have to monitor several currency pairs at the same time, who can trade more advanced tools. And I remember at the beginning, it was really like, we need to do everything more simple, or we need to keep everything more complicated. And at the end of the day, both has a reason to exist. And it's funny because today we sometimes go and see clients and we show them both, because it's the same backend system, but we ask them which level of complexity experience they want, and they can choose. So all this to say that the simplest design is not always the most efficient. It really depends on who you design for. And sometimes oversimplifying is dangerous. So after many years of like designing complex interfaces, I kind of realized that there was a kind of relation between complexity in users' interfaces. I'm going to introduce you to that. So I call it the UX efficient frontier. So you have the interface expertise. Basically, if you have ordered once on Uber Eats delivery, like food delivery, you know roughly how all the food delivery app works. It's kind of always the same patterns. But there's also you as a professional who has studies, who've done some business trainings or work experience. And if we plot the two together, so I think Christian this morning had an inverted bell curve. I have my own curve, which is concave. And here, what you can see is basically the relationship is everything that is all the combination above the curve is overcomplicated. I'll try to speak and pour water at the same time is difficult. And you're making it harder for people to use a service, and that's true. Like, there's a lot of legacy tools that are overcomplicated. People just like vomited a lot of data on a screen, and they didn't really thought much about the information hierarchy and stuff like that. So yes, the interface is too complex for what it is, but everything below the curve is oversimplified. And this is where it gets dangerous because, well, we're taking away people's agency. Ideally, you want to be in the middle, which is the efficient frontier. And the two services I shared previously, this is how we map them. Okay. Trying not to destroy the mic. Yeah, so basically to say that we want to give the right level of complexity to the right people. And there's nothing to be ashamed of, like wanting to use something simpler if your need is not like complex. That's basically extending the notion of suitability that we have in finance, which is like when you buy a financial product, the bank has a mission to make sure that you're buying something that you actually understand. I shouldn't start on this. And then it's the same with the interface. And yeah, remember like the traders that we've upset? Well, it's because we designed something that was so simple that we were in the danger zone. Again, oversimplified design. So to wrap up on this first section, well, for me, what we had to do before scaling is just to understand as well, and we had to also change the consensus in the design industry, which is not everything should be simplified. And life is complex, or work is complex, so tools can be too. Now the way that we think about our projects is really more like having a portfolio of diverse projects with different combination. And again, that's fine. And it's funny because if you have any designers that is oversimplifying everything, like send them to me. I'll send you the link to my talk, because I have a talk dedicated for the design community just for that. And it's funny because I had a lot of people reaching out afterwards saying how they were designing for example, the emergency services, where people need to see everything on the screen. And they were also feeling the pressure of simplifying stuff. So yeah, it's been quite interesting in terms of journey. Okay, now that I've clarified the approach that we want to take, how do we do that at scale? How do we do that on one project, on 100 projects? I feel like, yeah. And so here comes my next identity crisis. I have many identity crises because, okay, I agree, all projects, they're all different, we're all different. But after a while, I realized that dashboards, forms, workflows, reports, well, that's kind of like 90% of what we design. I know for you guys, if you work in the employee space or like the B2B space. And yeah, it's true, but the business is unique. But behind that, the human interaction with the interface, it's kind of like always the same things, like reaching out to data, making informed decisions, making some actions, and kind of designing the same thing over and over again kind of felt like. But maybe for you too, I don't know, come to me after, I want to hear your stories. Everyone knows this movie, or not know this movie, so it's the Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray plays a very, I think, narcissistic, self-centered weatherman who is kind of trapped into a time loop, and he has to repeat the day over and over again till he gets it right. Self-centered, narcissistic. No, I haven't said anything, it's just the slides that I'm just discovering, so yeah, I mean, those are the things I heard designers say. And it's interesting because that really questions the definition of design. So obviously here, I'm probably sure most people think design as an intent, organizing stuff. But sometimes we have to remind ourselves that design's mission is not to be art, it is to solve problems. And we don't have to be visually creative, maybe like be creative to solve issues and problems. And yeah, the idea is not to always reinvent the wheel. This is why very early on, we actually started to standardize all our UI components, so all the interface components. All the buttons, the cards, you don't have to be creative doing a button. Hopefully everyone agrees here, which is not sometimes the discussion we have in the design community. And today, this thing is called a design system. So a collection of guidelines and reusable assets. And what's different compared to the past, where everything was more or less like in a graphical charter in PDF. Here, it's implemented both in design and code. And for some designers, it's very hard to accept because especially like a lot of UX designers have a more like visual background, and we're kind of taking away the things that they like, creating those visual artifacts. And well, it's still hard for people who are doing the transition nowadays. This is why I call it like the 5 stages of grief for design systems. Have everyone seen this model stuff before? Basically, yeah, okay. We're going to go through this together from the viewpoint of a designer. So first, you're in denial. That design system is not for me. There's too many constraints. I cannot express myself. Then there's anger. This is the death of creativity. yeah, I can't tell you how much this conversation is still going on social media nowadays. Then depression. Oh, what's the point? I'm just pushing pixel anyway. Then bargaining, which I've seen happening. All right, I use it, but I'll make it my own. And this is where you start people like seeing like duplications of your design system with different colors and stuff like that. You're like, well, and acceptance. Okay, maybe I can do this. And as I said, it's very hard and this takes time, like the stage of grief, it takes time, because again, we're taking away the identity of those people and asking them to move on to something else. And the something else is really what should UX design be, and design in general, which is solving issues, not focusing on metrics. I remember at the very beginning, I was asked to give the number of, the number of screenshots generated. Oh, sorry, that's an artifact, and it's going to be so easy to just inflate that number. I'm just going to generate 1,000 screens, and will you pay me more? I don't know. But yeah, so focusing on before solving the issues, understanding what is the problem, finding solutions, ideating with people, and maybe measuring, if we can do that, that would be better, measuring the outcome. So that's what we should be focusing on, and not buttons, I guess. And we've been having a design system for 8 years, and so I'd like to think that we are way past the acceptance stage. And what's been interesting is this kind of mindset of reusing elements has kind of expanded throughout the team, which is now actually when a designer works on a problem, which is a business problem, they will have had the tendency to ask around, has anyone worked on something similar? This is why we call it the business design patterns, which is reusable solutions to business use cases. It's kind of extending the way that we think in terms of design systems, so like buttons, a card, but for business rules. So I know this is very theoretical, so I have an example. For check. Who knows what a for check is? All right, there's a few people, so I'll spend some time on those slides, if I have time. Yes. All right, you have this, actually, I think, in a lot of enterprises, where it's basically a process where you have, well, 2 pair of eyes, that's why it's for check, to check something that is done in a system. And you want to do that to limit the risk of errors, for example, sending a huge amount of money to someone, when you sometimes have these stories where something has been prevented because there was a FOIA check on the transaction. And to design this efficiently, we have to make sure that for the persons who is in front of the screen, we need to make sure that they show the risky areas of the content created, that we highlight the errors raised by previous people in the chain, and that we empower them to also input their own decisions in the system. So the way that it can look like is something like this. So on one side, so this is from one service that we have. On one side, we see the content, we have the warnings on the other side, and we have the action bar at the bottom. Now, obviously, this is very visual, but you have to think that we can also embed all the business rules, which is what qualifies as a validation. Is it like validation from your colleagues, your manager, or an external party? So there's different level of validation as well and rules. And yeah, so basically, in another service, we are trying to reuse this pattern. And as you can see, you have the content on one side, you have the highlighted errors and important stuff on the other side, and the action bar at the bottom. So really, the reason we're doing, the why, I guess, we're doing all this, is because documenting those patterns, it actually builds our enterprise collective memory. This is how we can dwell on the past and make sure that we embed also for the future. If, let's say, we iterate on this pattern, if we try on usability testing and it doesn't work, we want to change it. The reason why we're kind of going through this hassle to do it is to actually save the knowledge. And as I said, if you reuse it, curate, and evolve those patterns, it allows actually to amplify what works. It's kind of different than what we used to think. Like we would be, like digital transformation headquarters and give instruction to people, tell them the rules. Here it's very different. It's like we use the use cases that work already on projects and try to make sense of it, more like in a systemic way. Again, we start with real use cases and amplify them. So if I push the exercise a bit further, which is what we've done recently, Because at the end of the day, it's really nice to do that. I mean, obviously for the experience and stuff, but it's also good, as my CEO would say, it's good for design, it's good for the wallet. So, François, if you ever see this talk. We've done a full exercise, so I challenged the designer and the team. So next time you design a new project, can you list all the patterns, the business patterns you reuse, and please don't force yourself. Do it with ethic, right? Like, just do it if you think it's really useful and it's appropriate to reuse those patterns. So I'm not going to go through the whole table, but essentially, he realized that 80% of his estimated work would be reusable from other products. And the 80%, so that's why my CEO was very excited when he heard that, but there's a caveat, so let me go to that. Obviously, it's the initial research, it's the prototyping time, it's doing the specifications because we want to share also a piece of codes, and the testing. But again, we try to go fast where we need to be, which is basically all the design artifact. But really, like with all this time saved, he spent much more time with the projects, being able to study the problems. And even with project, when we say, hey, we're going to give you a designer who's trained on the design system, who has access to the knowledge of all the other services, so please, can we focus on the problem first? They are more likely to accept. And as I said, doing this builds upon the experience more globally. So I say, to kind of reach the level that we want to be in terms of seamless experience, that kind of helps as well. So wrapping up on this second section, design systems and patterns really us to develop the design methodology in thinking at scale. And like everything that scales, industrialization is part of the job, and it's not a dirty thing. I feel like, again, I think in the audience here, everyone is convinced, but there's a lot of parallel being drawn into like industrialization of food or like craft and everything. So it's very hard to explain that, no, we need to focus on the problem and not all the visual artifacts. And yeah, there's nothing to be ashamed of. All right, so the last part, which is the trickiest, I guess, is how do you adapt the org to be able to do all this? Because do you organize the work the same way when you work on one project or 100? And I think is it mine? I don't know, my biggest hot take is here, which is when I first started the team, everyone was doing this. Okay, given the number of laughs, I think everyone has an idea of what I'm going to say next. But has anyone not heard about the Spotify model before? The squad, so basically designers usually being like, in the very beginning, designs were completely externalized, and then we put them into like a kind of agency style of thing. And then everyone wanted to put designers in squads with the products. And I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but it doesn't work for everyone. And certainly not for us, because remember, we are so siloed already. So how do you want to design something that makes sense at scale when your designers are already siloed? And I remember having very, very difficult conversation, but I'm French, so I like to be in the disagreement with people. But back then, honestly, everyone, the IT leaders, the consulting firms, like everyone was like, just put your designers in squads. And so I had to explain that it doesn't solve problems of fragmented UX. So sure, one route that we could have taken is just hire more designers to design. But no, that's not me. But yeah, again, all silos, how do we do with all silos? So getting a good idea is not always adding on more people. And instead, what we decided to do is we wanted to utilize more people in the organization and optimize our way to work with them. I think, especially in the design industry, we tend to be too much on social media. And so when something works, then everyone kind of like, it snowballs, you know? Or maybe it's not just my industry, I don't know. But I remember studying this at school, and maybe most of you will know this theory, but it just amazed me how everyone forgets about it as soon as it's on social media and trending stuff. But the idea is not to copy-paste something or an idea or methods. It really needs to work with your context. And this is what I've been trying to do, at least in my organization. Again, we wanted to infuse design and not necessarily add more people because we were already a lot. So that means that for the design team, what we really wanted to do is keep the team small so we can be quick in sharing the information, be responsible and establish what good design means, work in partnership with projects. So again, we went from basically the kind of external agency model to designers in squads to the partnership model, and establish patterns for everyone. So done through the design system and our business design patterns. So that sounds cool on paper, or on slide, I guess. But in reality, for that to work, there's something major that has to change, which is people's mindset. Because very often, this is how we find ourselves, and I know a lot of frustrated designers in organizations are like that, because you have people who say this, you're a bottleneck, here comes the design police, don't ask questions. We are things I've heard in my career. And designers on the other side, they say this, they just don't get design. Why won't they let me do it? Can't they see the problem? Which is also things I heard in my career. So yeah, how do you change the us versus them mentality to, working together to avoid failure? It's so easy when you draw it out, right? But to do it, it's difficult. You need time. You can't just implement an update process to everyone's brain. But it would be dangerous, right? 'Cause, imagine someone who has a God mod into that. I was like, I don't know. But yeah, it takes time. It's painful. You can't avoid difficult conversation, but it's really worth doing because once you've done this, you can really change the dynamic. Because when there's trust, you can share more, and you don't have to feel that you always have to back yourself with emails, polished deliverables, and things like that. So I'd like to finish my talk with 2 examples where we try to change this dynamic and work better, smarter with people. So the first one, this is not an architecture diagram. This is a human, which is kind of the same. Basically, we kind of analyze the flow of people on an organization, on a service. So it's called a user flow. But we've started to open a design process. Because designers at school, what they are taught is actually to go on, study people, and kind of build these things. But in very complex environments, that can take months. And I've seen projects take months. And obviously, consulting companies, they like to bill you months to do that. What we try to do instead is we ask people to do it because honestly, business analysts, even architects, okay, maybe they were doing that with technical flows. They can definitely do it with humans. And it doesn't mean that it will be perfect, but at least it's a base that we can iterate on and work on it together. So we like to call it the homeworks for these business sponsors. They have to come with an idea because we don't have time to sit down and just try to build it ourselves, especially in things like KYC, loan originations. That's kind of intense. The second example of working smarter is the relationship between designers and developers, which is a whole other area. Because designers work in design tools, so tools like XD, Sketch, Figma, and developers, work with developers tools like VS Code and use code libraries, right? And there's a lot of, I would say, misunderstanding and lost in translation when the two together need to work together. So designers will do these compositions and those images, hand over to a developer who try to interpret what they wanted. And when you do the demo at the end, it looks nothing like what you've designed. And that was creating a lot of time and drama, I guess. So what we ended up doing is try to create that common ground. And for us, the way we've done it is by creating a new tool, which is Design Lab. So that Design Lab is not to design experiences, and it's not for end-up production code. It's the thing in the middle where the designers can share a bit of UI elements to explain to the developer how to work with whatever design they've made. And the developer can go on it and share, if they have an issue, they can share a piece of code without us having to install the whole suite of tools. And I'm going to just finish the talk by doing a little demo, if I can. No. The video is here, so do you know how to? Video. Yes. Yeah, well done. Cool. So as you can see, it runs in the browser. There's like a panel where you can just basically click your way into the component, customize it, and you actually don't need to understand code at this moment, but it's plugged into your design system, so it runs real code, I guess. And then you can insert it into like this coding area, and then you have the preview where it's preloaded with the themes, so the standard themes, the dark themes, different viewports, you can test everything. And obviously, we want them to also be very aware of the guidelines, so then we go into these guidelines where we try to document how to use elements, where to use them, etc. Great. So yeah, final wrap up. At scale, the rules of the game change. And I think the first thing, my message at least, is to be aware of the consensus, because something that even just works on one project may not work at scale. And for us, it was maybe just also to change our approach to design. So again, the simplest design is not always the most efficient, and oversimplification is dangerous, especially in the B2B and B2E space. Yeah, it's not a bad thing to industrialize our practices. And for us as designers, we do it through design system and patterns to build the kind of collective memory of the enterprise and amplify what works. And finally, to adapt your org to your context, well, for us, we have decided to stay a small design team. So we are about 20 across London and Paris today to fight entropy, hopefully. And yeah, scale can happen by optimizing how we work already with those wonderful people. And you don't really can escape the work that we have to do on the organization setup. If you're interested in more stories on complex design and systems, we, like, I guess every design team has a Medium, so you can go and read. Again, make informed decision, not copy-paste, but copy-paste if it works for you, I guess. Yeah, and that's for me. You can connect with me on Medium, Twitter, LinkedIn. I forgot LinkedIn, but yeah, I'm Morgane Peng. Thank you.